A trap is most powerful when it does not look like a trap. It looks like virtue, humility, obedience, purity, sacrifice, and the promise that suffering itself can make you holy. Nietzsche believed Christian morality did exactly that. It turned inner conflict into righteousness, fear into virtue, and obedience into spiritual beauty until the cage no longer needed a lock because believers had learned to call it good. Here's the question that most people inside that moral system were never permitted to ask. Not whether God exists, not whether Scripture is reliable, not even whether the church told the truth about history. The deeper and far more dangerous question is this: what if the morality itself is the problem? What if the very values taught as sacred, the humility, the guilt, the self-denial, the submission, are not simply rules about how to behave, but a carefully constructed architecture that decides who is allowed to feel worthy, who must remain silent, and who will carry shame as a permanent spiritual condition? That question is not comfortable. It is not the question of someone who was never hurt by religion. It is the question of someone who lived inside a moral framework, tried to be good inside it, and slowly began to notice that the framework seemed to produce as much suffering as it claimed to heal. It is the question Nietzsche refused to avoid, and it is the question this investigation will follow, all the way to its most disturbing conclusion. Friedrich Nietzsche was born in 1844 in the Prussian province of Saxony. He was the son of a Lutheran pastor, raised in a deeply Christian household, educated in classical philology, and eventually appointed as a professor at the University of Basel before he had even completed his doctorate. He was, by almost every measure of his time, a man formed by the very tradition he would spend his life dismantling. That biographical fact is not incidental. It is essential. Nietzsche did not critique Christian morality from the outside, from a position of detached atheist indifference. He critiqued it from the inside, from the position of someone who had internalized its values deeply enough to understand exactly how they worked. The tool Nietzsche developed for this investigation was not simple mockery. It was genealogy, a philosophical method he described as tracing the origin of moral values in order to understand not whether they are good, but where they came from, who created them, what conditions produced them, and what kind of human being they served. His central argument, developed most powerfully in works such as On the Genealogy of Morality and Beyond Good and Evil, was that the values Christianity called universal and divine were not handed down from heaven. They were invented. They were invented under specific historical circumstances, by specific people, in a specific emotional and social condition. And understanding that condition, Nietzsche believed, changes everything about how those values must be judged. The moral teaching that millions received as Christian did not arrive as a philosophical argument. It arrived as a world. It arrived in the form of stories, liturgy, confession, catechism, and repeated instruction that shaped the imagination before the intellect had any chance to evaluate what was being placed inside it. The core of that inherited moral system can be organized around several interlocking ideals. Humility is not merely a virtue among others. It is the condition of a properly oriented soul. The person who thinks too highly of themselves, who prizes their own strength, intelligence, or beauty, has committed a spiritual error. Pride is the first and oldest sin. The correct posture before God, before the community of believers, and before one's own desires, is a posture of lowering. Alongside humility came obedience. The believer is not invited to construct their own moral framework through personal reasoning or felt experience. They are invited to submit to Scripture, to the church, to properly constituted spiritual authority, and ultimately to the will of God, which is communicated through those channels. The believer who insists on their own moral judgment above these authorities is not exercising spiritual courage. They are exhibiting dangerous pride. The virtuous person trusts the structure they were given. They place their will beneath a larger will, and they experience that placement not as defeat, but as liberation, the liberation of the soul relieved from the burden of choosing its own direction. And then there is suffering. Inside the Christian moral framework as it was transmitted through centuries of preaching, confession, and devotional practice, suffering is not simply a misfortune to be reduced. It is a spiritual category. It can purify. It can sanctify. The person who suffers with patience, who endures their pain without complaint or rebellion, who accepts their condition as part of a divine plan they cannot fully comprehend, is not merely tolerating a difficult life. They are participating in something sacred. They are following the path of the figure at the center of the tradition, the one who suffered publicly, completely, and redemptively. Suffering, in this framework, is not the enemy of spiritual life. In the right hands, with the right interior disposition, it becomes the very material out of which holiness is made. For millions of people across centuries and across cultures, these ideals did not feel like a cage. They felt like a shelter. To understand Nietzsche's critique honestly, we must begin by taking that feeling seriously, because the critique lands nowhere if we pretend the moral system offered nothing real, nothing comforting, nothing genuinely meaningful. For people who were suffering in ways they could not control, poverty, illness, social powerlessness, grief, the subordinate position in a rigid social hierarchy, the teaching that their suffering was not meaningless, that it had spiritual weight, that it connected them to something larger than their own diminished circumstances, was not propaganda. It was oxygen. It allowed them to continue living with dignity inside conditions that offered very little of it. The ideal of humility also carried a particular emotional charge for people who had been made to feel small by forces that had nothing to do with their moral character. If the great and the powerful and the proud were actually spiritually inferior to the quiet, the lowly, and the meek, then the social order of the world was not the final word on anyone's worth. The servant was not less than the master in the eyes of the God who actually mattered. The widow, the orphan, the debtor, the slave, all of those who occupied the lowest positions in ancient Mediterranean society and in every hierarchical society that followed, could hear in that moral teaching something that felt like justice, something that reversed the visible order of things and placed real value where the world had placed contempt. And obedience to something larger than the self offered its own particular relief. The weight of constructing a meaningful life from scratch, the anxiety of deciding alone what is true and good and worth living for, is genuinely difficult. A moral framework that provides clear answers, clear boundaries, and a clear sense of what righteousness looks like removes a significant cognitive and emotional burden. It places the believer inside a structure that has already done the work of meaning-making. To live inside that structure is not necessarily to be oppressed by it. For many people, it was to be held by it. The question Nietzsche forced onto the table was not whether the shelter felt real, but what the shelter cost. The crack does not begin with a dramatic rupture. It begins with a quiet and deeply uncomfortable observation. The same moral system that offered comfort to the suffering also told the suffering that their suffering was spiritually appropriate. The same tradition that dignified the humble also instructed the humble to remain humble. not merely as a private interior orientation, but as a public and permanent identity. The same framework that promised liberation from the tyranny of pride also treated the desire for strength, self-expression, and self-determination as morally suspect. And here, very carefully, the question changes shape. It is no longer simply whether Christian morality offered something valuable to people in pain. The question becomes whether that offer also contained instructions to stay in pain. A moral system can do two things at once. It can provide genuine meaning and also reinforce the conditions that made meaning necessary. It can honor the suffering person and also teach that person to distrust the impulse to escape their suffering through strength, ambition, self-trust, or desire. It can call guilt a sign of spiritual sensitivity and also use guilt to ensure that the believer never strays too far from the boundaries the system has drawn. These two functions do not cancel each other out. They coexist. And the fact that they coexist is what makes the trap beautiful, because a trap that offered nothing would not work. The trap works precisely because the offer is real. The shelter is real. The meaning is real. And it is exactly those real things that make the cage difficult to see. If this investigation is already opening something you have carried privately for a long time, consider pressing the like on this video. It signals to those who are still looking that the questions inside this archive are worth finding. And now, with that first crack visible, it is time to go deeper into the world that produced these values, because the story of Christian morality does not begin in heaven. It begins in history, and history has a way of changing everything. To understand what Nietzsche was pointing at, you have to see the world in which Christian moral ideals first took root and began to harden into doctrine. That world was the ancient Mediterranean basin of the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era. It was a world of staggering social inequality, organized around a Roman imperial system that was, by any honest description, one of the most efficient and merciless hierarchical machines the ancient world had ever produced. At the top of that system were the emperor, the senatorial class, the military commanders, and the provincial governors. Below them were layers of intermediate social status, stretching down through merchants, artisans, freedmen, and agricultural workers. At the very bottom, accounting for somewhere between 20 and 30% of the population of the Roman Empire, according to many historians, were enslaved human beings, people who had no legal standing, no right to their own bodies, no capacity to refuse labor or violence, and no social future that was not determined entirely by the will of another person. Into this world came a movement centered on a figure who had been publicly executed in one of the most humiliating methods the Roman system had devised: crucifixion, a death explicitly designed to maximize degradation and display it publicly as a warning. The earliest communities around this figure were drawn disproportionately, though not exclusively, from the lower strata of that social world. Paul's letter to the Corinthians, one of the earliest Christian documents we possess, acknowledges explicitly that not many of the community's members were wise according to worldly standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth. That is not a condemnation of those communities. It is a sociological observation about who the earliest Christian message reached and why. What the earliest Christian communities offered to those populations was a complete inversion of the values of the dominant social order. In the Roman world, power, honor, strength, nobility, and the capacity to impose your will on others were treated as markers of virtue. They were the qualities that entitled a person to respect. Christianity, particularly as it developed through the theology of Paul and through the gospel traditions, offered something else entirely. It said that the last would be first, that the meek would inherit the earth, that the poor in spirit were blessed, that the one who wished to lead must become the servant of all, that the powerful man who could not humble himself was in greater spiritual danger than the enslaved person who had nothing. This was not a minor adjustment to Roman values. It was a complete reversal. And for people who had nothing in the Roman system of honor and power, that reversal was electrifying. The ascetic traditions that developed within Christianity across the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries deepened this moral inversion into a comprehensive life practice. Monks, desert fathers, and later institutionalized religious communities built entire systems of discipline around the renunciation of pleasure, the subordination of the body to the spirit, the crushing of personal desire, and the cultivation of radical obedience to spiritual authority. These were not fringe movements. They became enormously influential, shaping the moral imagination of Western Christianity for over 1,000 years. By the time the Roman Empire had Christianized under Constantine in the 4th century, these values had begun to migrate from the margins of society, where they had offered consolation to the powerless, into the center of institutional power, where they would take on a very different function. The world that produced Christian morality was, therefore, a world of extreme social suffering, concentrated power, widespread helplessness, and urgent need for a meaning system that could make that helplessness bearable. Nietzsche saw this origin not as a coincidence, but as the defining key to understanding what Christian morality actually was. A value system is not just a set of ideas floating freely above the conditions of human life. It is shaped by those conditions. It is a response to them. And when you trace Christian morality back to its origins in the suffering and resentment of the ancient world's lowest social classes, you begin to see the architecture beneath the beauty in a way that is very difficult to unsee. When a belief system teaches that humility is holy, obedience is sacred, suffering is redemptive, and pride is the first of sins, it is worth asking seriously: who benefits when those values become authoritative across an entire civilization? The answer is not a simple conspiracy. It is something more interesting and more structurally revealing than that. The question is not whether any group of people deliberately invented these values as a tool of manipulation. The question is, which social arrangements were stabilized, reinforced, and protected once these values became the dominant moral language of an entire culture? The clergy and the institutional church that developed from the 4th century onward were among the most significant beneficiaries of a moral system that sacralized obedience and condemned pride. A community that has been taught, at the deepest level of its moral formation, that submission to spiritual authority is a virtue, and that resistance to that authority is a sin, is a community that is extraordinarily difficult to organize in opposition to its leaders. If your internal emotional life has been structured by a moral system that treats your own judgment as potentially corrupted by pride, the act of questioning your bishop, your priest, your confessor, or your spiritual director becomes not just socially transgressive, but spiritually dangerous. You are not just risking social conflict, you are risking your soul. That is an enormously powerful mechanism for preserving institutional authority, and it does not require anyone to have designed it deliberately in order to function. The feudal social order that dominated medieval European society also found extraordinary support in a Christian moral framework that sacralized one's station in life and treated ambition as spiritually suspect. If God has placed you in a particular social position, and the virtuous response to that placement is humble acceptance, rather than worldly striving, then the rigid hierarchy of medieval society is not simply a political arrangement that could be questioned and renegotiated. It is a spiritual given, the shape that the divine will has chosen for social life. The serf who accepts their condition with Christian patience is practicing a virtue. The serf who organizes to challenge it is flirting with pride, disobedience, and spiritual rebellion. These are not accidents of doctrine. They are structural consequences of a moral system that placed obedience above self-determination. The use of guilt as a pastoral and institutional mechanism deserves particular attention in this context. The sacramental system of confession, penance, and absolution that developed across the medieval church created a structure in which the believer's most intimate inner life, their desires, their ambitions, their resentments, their fantasies, became a domain of institutional surveillance. Not external surveillance through observation from the outside, but internal surveillance, the kind that operates through the conscience itself. A person who has been taught that impure thoughts are sins, that desire for more than their assigned portion is spiritually dangerous, that anger toward authority may itself be a form of pride, carries the church inside them. They do not need a guard at the door because the guard is already in the mind, dressed in the language of conscience, guilt, and the fear of divine judgment. To say that these institutional arrangements benefited from Christian morality is not to say that every priest was a cynic, or that every bishop understood themselves to be an agent of social control. The overwhelming majority of people who taught these values believed them sincerely and experienced them as genuinely good. Sincere belief and structural function are not the same thing. A person can genuinely believe that humility is a virtue, and also live inside a social arrangement in which the teaching of humility serves to keep certain groups of people from challenging the people above them. Both of those things can be true simultaneously. Nietzsche's genealogical method insists that we look at both at once, not to condemn the believer, but to understand the full picture of what the belief accomplished. The deepest contradiction inside Christian morality, as Nietzsche understood it, is this: a system that presents itself as the liberation of the soul from sin and death is simultaneously a system that produces a specific kind of prisoner. The prisoner is not someone locked in a cell they can see. The prisoner is someone who has learned to experience their own desires, their own strength, their own vitality, and their own self-determination as morally dangerous. The contradiction is that the freedom the system promises is purchased at the cost of the very capacities that would make freedom real. Humility, as it functions in much of the Christian moral tradition, is not simply the absence of arrogance. In its more demanding forms, it is the systematic training of a person to distrust their own perception of their own worth. The humble believer is not someone who has accurately assessed their strengths and weaknesses and arrived at a balanced self-understanding. The humble believer is someone who has been taught to view the very act of taking themselves seriously, of valuing their own gifts, of asserting their own needs, as a spiritual danger. There is a difference between genuine modesty, the honest acknowledgement of one's limitations, and a moral system that treats self-affirmation as the gateway to sin. Nietzsche argued that Christian humility had crossed that line, that it had moved from a corrective on vanity to a systematic attack on the human capacity for self-respect. The treatment of desire within the tradition creates an equally sharp contradiction. The body and its appetites, sexuality, physical pleasure, the desire for beauty or power or material comfort were treated across large portions of Christian history as spiritually suspect at best and actively dangerous at worst. Augustine's theology of original sin placed concupiscence, the disordered desire that pulls toward bodily pleasure, at the center of the human condition after the fall. Jerome's asceticism treated the body as an enemy to be subdued. The monastic traditions turned the suppression of physical desire into a spiritual discipline, and that discipline migrated into the broader moral expectations of lay Christians in diluted but persistent forms. The contradiction here is not that a tradition recommends self-control. The contradiction is that a tradition which claims to affirm creation, to celebrate the goodness of a God who made embodied human beings, simultaneously treats the most natural expressions of embodied life as the primary location of spiritual danger. Guilt operates inside this system as both a diagnostic tool and a permanent condition. The conscience that feels guilt is, in the framework of Christian moral formation, a conscience that is working correctly. It is the voice of the moral law making itself felt against the resistance of the sinful will. But there is a point at which a diagnostic tool becomes a chronic disease. When the capacity to feel guilt is trained so thoroughly, when the categories of sinful thought are drawn so widely, when even the impulse to question the moral system itself becomes a potential sign of pride or faithlessness, guilt is no longer functioning as a corrective. It is functioning as a general atmosphere in which the believer lives and breathes. Nietzsche saw this chronic guilt not as a sign of spiritual health, but as one of the most revealing symptoms of what he called the bad conscience, an internalized self-torment that a particular kind of moral formation produces as its most intimate fruit. The contradiction, finally, is between the tradition's stated aim and its observed psychological effect. If Christian morality is designed to produce human flourishing, freedom, love, and the fullest possible expression of human dignity, the question that Nietzsche refused to let rest is why its most consistent psychological output, across centuries and across cultures, includes shame about the body, fear of desire, chronic guilt, and a systematic distrust of self-affirmation. A medicine that reliably produces the symptoms it claims to treat is not simply a medicine with some side effects. It is something that requires a different description altogether. Nietzsche's description was not polite, but it was specific, and it is to that specific description that we must now turn. Nietzsche's central concept for understanding the origin of Christian morality is one of the most startling and uncomfortable ideas in the history of philosophy. He called it slave morality, and the name is deliberately provocative, but the idea beneath it is more precise and more disturbing than the provocation suggests. To understand it, we have to begin where Nietzsche began, with a question about how values are created in the first place. Where do the ideas of good and evil come from? Who made them? Under what circumstances were they made? And what kind of human life do they serve? Nietzsche distinguished between two fundamentally different ways that human beings create moral values. The first he called master morality. In this mode, the strong, the noble, the powerful, those who experience themselves as vital, capable, and full of life, begin by affirming themselves. They say yes to their own strength, their own qualities, their own existence. The category of good emerges first as a description of what they are and what they value. The category of bad is secondary and relatively pale. It is simply the contrast, what is weak, what is undistinguished, what falls below the standard of vitality they have set for themselves. In master morality, the primary movement is an affirmation, a yes to life and its fullest expressions. Slave morality, in Nietzsche's account, is something entirely different in its psychological mechanics. It does not begin with a yes, it begins with a no. It begins with what he called Ressentiment, a French word he chose deliberately to convey a particular kind of resentment, not the hot and quickly discharged anger of someone who strikes back immediately, but the cold, accumulated, smoldering resentment of someone who cannot act on their anger and who therefore turns it inward, transforming it into something that feels like a moral position. The weak, the suffering, the powerless, those who cannot compete with the strong in the terms the strong have set, do not simply accept their inferiority. They transform it. They create a new set of values, and in this new set, the qualities of the powerful, strength, ambition, pride, vitality, self-assertion, are redefined as evil, and the qualities of the powerless, humility, submission, patience, self-denial, suffering, are redefined as good. This is what Nietzsche called the moral revaluation of values, or in his more dramatic language, the slave revolt in morality. It is the moment when the weak, unable to defeat the strong in open conflict, win a different kind of victory by changing the meaning of the game entirely, by declaring that the very qualities of their opponents are morally corrupt, and that their own qualities, the qualities that their weakness has imposed on them, are in fact the highest virtues. They achieve a victory that requires no physical power. They achieve it through the creation of a value system that, once internalized, makes the strong feel guilty for their strength, and the weak feel righteous in their weakness. Nietzsche was careful, at least in his more precise moments, to distinguish between the philosophical analysis of this process and a simple condemnation of the people who underwent it. He did not say that the people who created slave morality were dishonest or malicious. He said they were creative. He said they performed an act of philosophical invention under conditions of extreme suffering, and that the invention worked, that it spread, that it conquered, that it became the dominant moral framework of an entire civilization. His argument was not that this was done by bad people. His argument was that understanding it requires seeing it clearly, without the assumption that because something feels sacred, it must be beyond the reach of historical and psychological investigation. The phrase that Nietzsche used to describe the whole movement is the transvaluation of all values. By this, he meant that Christianity, or at least the moral system that developed under that name, did not simply add new values to the ones already present in the ancient world. It inverted them. It took what the ancient world of nobility and power had placed at the top and moved it to the bottom, and took what had been at the bottom and elevated it to a position of supreme moral worth. Weakness became holiness. Humility became the greatest virtue. Suffering became the path to God. And pride, the most fundamental expression of self-affirmation in the ancient aristocratic world, became the first and deadliest sin. That inversion, Nietzsche argued, is the hidden architecture inside every major Christian moral teaching. When you apply Nietzsche's lens directly to the specific moral doctrines of Christianity, the effect is not a simple refutation. It is a recontextualization that makes familiar teachings look completely different. Take the doctrine of original sin. In the Christian framework as it was transmitted from Augustine onward, the human being enters existence already compromised. Before any choice has been made, before any action has been taken, there is already a fundamental deficiency that must be acknowledged, confessed, and addressed through divine grace. The human being cannot earn salvation because the human being cannot even reach a position of moral neutrality through their own effort. They are dependent. They are in need. And that need is not a circumstance to be improved. It is the defining truth of the human condition. Nietzsche's reading of this doctrine is not that it is intellectually absurd. His reading is that it is psychologically precise. a moral system that begins with the premise of the individual's fundamental inadequacy has already ensured that the individual will spend their life reaching toward a standard that is, by definition, beyond their own achievement. The specific treatment of pride within the tradition reveals the mechanism most clearly. Pride, according to much of the Christian moral tradition, is not merely an unpleasant personality trait. It is the root of all other sins. It is the orientation that places the self at the center where God should be. The corrective to pride is humility, which means not simply an accurate assessment of one's limitations, but a continuous orientation of the self downward. The problem that Nietzsche identifies is not with the impulse to correct vanity. The problem is with a moral system that treats the affirmation of the self, the valuing of one's own experience, the trusting of one's own judgment, as the location where sin enters. If the primary danger to your spiritual life is always the risk of thinking too well of yourself, then the moral system has created a permanent internal alarm system that fires whenever you feel strong, capable, or worthy. Self-denial, in its Christian formulation, involves the systematic suppression of personal desire in favor of conformity to a divinely established moral order. In its most demanding forms, this means not only controlling behavior, but policing the inner life, the thoughts, the desires, the fantasies, the appetites, and the impulses that arise before any act of will has occurred. The Christian who has been thoroughly formed by this moral framework does not simply choose not to act on certain desires. They experience the existence of the desire as already a moral problem. The desire itself becomes evidence of the sinful will that requires constant vigilance. Nietzsche's argument is that this creates a particular kind of inner life, one that is constantly at war with itself, one that experiences its own vitality as dangerous, and that has been trained to interpret the suppression of that vitality as spiritual progress. The moral treatment of forgiveness also reveals something interesting under Nietzsche's examination. In the Christian framework, forgiveness is among the highest virtues. The believer is called not only to accept divine forgiveness for their own failures, but to extend forgiveness to those who have wronged them, even when that wrong is severe. This teaching has genuine moral beauty. There is something genuinely admirable about a human being who can release resentment and extend compassion toward someone who caused them harm. But Nietzsche noticed something else inside the structure of forgiveness as it functioned within the tradition. He noticed that it could also function as a mechanism for preventing legitimate anger from finding its natural expression and resolution. A person who has been genuinely wronged, who has been harmed by someone with greater power, who has a legitimate grievance against an institution or an authority, and who is told that the highest spiritual response to that harm is forgiveness, faces a very particular moral bind. Their anger, which may be entirely warranted, becomes spiritually disqualifying. Their indignation is reframed as a failure of character. Guilt, as it operates within Christian moral formation, is simultaneously the system's most effective tool and its most revealing artifact. The confession of sin is not simply an admission that one has done wrong. In the full ritual context of sacramental confession, it is an act of self-exposure before authority, an acknowledgement that one's inner life is subject to examination by an institutional representative of the divine, and a submission to the judgment and prescribed remedy of that representative. The penitent who approaches confession regularly has been trained to treat their own conscience as a kind of prosecutorial instrument, constantly reviewing their thoughts, desires, and actions for evidence of failure. Nietzsche did not argue that this produced no benefit. He argued that its consistent psychological byproduct was a self that had learned to relate to itself primarily through the lens of inadequacy and the need for forgiveness, a self that understood its fundamental condition as being in debt to a standard it could not meet. The suspicion of desire that runs through Christian moral teaching, particularly in its treatment of the body, sexuality, and physical pleasure, represents perhaps the most intimate application of Nietzsche's critique, when the body and its appetites are treated as the primary location of spiritual danger, and when the subduing of those appetites is treated as the primary evidence of spiritual progress. The believer has been placed in a relationship with their own physical existence that Nietzsche would describe as fundamentally life-denying, a tradition that celebrates the incarnation as the entry of the divine into bodily human existence also produced centuries of teaching in which the body was experienced primarily as a moral problem. That contradiction between the theological affirmation of embodied life and the moral suspicion of the body's appetites is one of the places where Nietzsche's lens finds its sharpest focus. The most dangerous implication of Nietzsche's critique is not the one that sounds most dramatic on the surface. It is not simply the claim that Christianity is false, or that God does not exist, or that priests are hypocrites. Those are all familiar enough positions that they can be absorbed and dismissed. The genuinely dangerous implication is quieter and more precise, and it goes like this. A moral system that is experienced as spiritually liberating may simultaneously function as a system that teaches a person to experience their own most vital capacities as their primary moral danger. And when that happens, the liberation the system promises is always structurally deferred. You cannot be truly free within a moral framework that treats your own self-affirmation as the entrance to sin. Consider what it means to grow up inside a moral formation in which pride is the first sin, desire is suspect, ambition is spiritually dangerous, and the highest virtue is submission to an authority that claims to speak for God. Consider what that formation does to the experience of having an opinion that differs from official teaching. Consider what it does to the experience of feeling strong, capable, and confident in one's own judgment. Consider what it does to the experience of sexual desire, physical pleasure, or the simple appetite for more than one has been assigned. Nietzsche's argument is that a thoroughly formed Christian conscience does not experience these things neutrally. It experiences them through a moral lens that has already defined them as threats to spiritual integrity. The result is a person who has been trained to experience their own life force as morally dangerous. This is what Nietzsche meant by the concept he called the will to power, though this concept is almost universally misunderstood. He did not mean the desire to dominate others. He meant something closer to the fundamental drive of living organisms toward self-expression, growth, and the overcoming of resistance. He argued that all living things, human beings most certainly included, have a basic orientation toward the expansion and expression of their capacities. A moral system that systematically frames that orientation as sinful is not simply offering a corrective to human excess. It is working against something that Nietzsche considered fundamental to what life is. And a morality that works against life, he argued, should not be called good simply because it calls itself good. The implication for those who were most thoroughly formed by Christian moral teaching is that the internal critic inside their heads, the voice that says you are too proud, your desire is corrupting you, you must humble yourself further, you must submit more completely, may not be the voice of conscience properly understood. It may be, as Nietzsche described it, the internalized voice of a value system that has a structural interest in maintaining your sense of inadequacy. A believer who never feels fully worthy who always needs one more confession, one more act of penance, one more round of spiritual discipline, remains permanently attached to the system that provides the mechanisms for managing that inadequacy. The incompleteness of the believer is not a flaw in the system. It is the system working exactly as its psychological architecture produces. This implication extends beyond individual psychology into cultural and intellectual life. A civilization whose dominant moral framework trains its members to be suspicious of their own strength, to defer instinctively to authority, to experience the questioning of inherited values as spiritual danger, is a civilization that has built its own conservative mechanism into the moral conscience of its population. Heresy in this framework is not simply a theological error, it is a moral failing. The person who questions the established belief is not simply mistaken. They are prideful, they are rebellious, they are placing their own inadequate judgment above the accumulated wisdom of the tradition. That framing does not simply discourage intellectual dissent, it makes intellectual dissent feel like a violation of the self. The dangerous implication, finally, is that a person cannot fully evaluate the moral framework they were raised inside by using the moral tools the framework itself provided, because those tools were designed within the framework and carry its assumptions. To ask whether Christian morality is truly good using only the categories that Christian morality supplies is like asking the guard of a prison to evaluate whether the prison is just, using only the prison's own rulebook as a standard of justice. What Nietzsche demanded, and what made him so permanently uncomfortable to read, was a genuinely external standard, a different vantage point from which to look at what morality does, not just what it claims. That demand is dangerous precisely because it cannot be answered from inside the system that raises the discomfort in the first place. A moral system that produces obedient, humble, guilt-managed, and self-denying individuals is, from the perspective of institutions that require social order, an extraordinarily useful thing. This is not a cynical observation. It is a structural one, and it applies not only to explicitly religious institutions, but to every social arrangement that has ever drawn on Christian moral vocabulary to organize the behavior of large numbers of people. The usefulness of the belief is not evidence that the belief is false, but it is evidence that the belief serves functions beyond the spiritual ones its promoters advertised. And understanding those functions is essential for understanding what the belief actually did in the world. In the medieval period, the Church's teaching on humility, submission, and the spiritual danger of ambition mapped almost perfectly onto the needs of a feudal social order that required the vast majority of its population to accept hereditary social positions they had not chosen and could not escape. The theology did not create the feudal system, and the feudal system did not create the theology. But the theology and the social system reinforced each other in ways that served the interests of those who occupied the upper levels of both structures. A peasant who has been thoroughly formed by a moral system that treats acceptance of one's station as a virtue and ambition as a spiritual danger is a peasant who is psychologically equipped to continue being a peasant. That is useful information, regardless of how sincerely the teaching was offered. In the early modern period, as European colonial powers moved into the Americas, Africa, and Asia, Christian moral vocabulary provided a framework that made the subordination of colonized populations legible as something other than simple exploitation. The colonized were invited to accept their condition with Christian patience. They were told that their suffering had spiritual meaning. They were given a moral framework in which obedience to those placed above them, even those placed above them by violence, was a virtue, while resistance was a sin. The missionaries who delivered this message often did so with complete sincerity. The sincerity does not remove the structural function. A moral system that teaches the colonized to understand their subjugation as spiritually appropriate is a moral system that is being extraordinarily useful to the colonizers, whether or not any individual missionary intended that function. In the domestic management of gender across most of Christian history, the same moral logic appears with striking consistency. Women were instructed in humility, submission to male authority, self-denial, suspicion of their own desires, silence in public religious contexts, and the spiritual value of patient suffering. These instructions were not presented as tools of social control. They were presented as the moral requirements of a life properly ordered before God. But the effect of a moral framework that systematically trains women to distrust their own judgment, suppress their own desires, remain silent in the presence of authority, and accept their social position with Christian patience, is the long-term reproduction of social arrangements that concentrate power in the hands of men. The moral beauty of the teaching served the social utility of the outcome. None of this requires the existence of a hidden conspiracy or a deliberate strategy of manipulation. It requires only that we notice what Nietzsche insisted on noticing: that moral systems have beneficiaries, that those beneficiaries tend to be enthusiastic promoters of the systems that serve them, and that the sincerity of any individual promoter tells us nothing reliable about the structural function of what they are promoting. The useful belief and the sincere belief are not mutually exclusive categories. The history of Christian morality contains an enormous amount of genuine sincerity in service of teachings that also happened to be extraordinarily convenient for those who held social power. The moral framework we have been examining does not remain at the level of theology or social organization. It goes inside. It becomes the structure of the inner life. And the psychological effects that Nietzsche identified in the people most thoroughly formed by Christian moral teaching are not gentle. They include a chronic sense of unworthiness, a deep suspicion of one's own desires, a tendency to experience legitimate needs as potential sins, a fear of pride so thorough that it extends to the basic acts of self-trust and self-valuation, and a relationship with guilt that is not remedial, but ambient, a permanent weather condition of the conscience, rather than a specific signal about a specific wrong. Shame, as it operates within Christian moral formation, is importantly different from guilt in its psychological mechanics. Guilt says I did something wrong and the wrong can be addressed. Shame says I am something wrong and the wrongness is my condition. Much of what passes under the name of conscience in a thoroughly formed Christian inner life is not the remedial guilt of someone who has acted against their own values. It is the ambient shame of someone who has been taught that their basic nature is a problem, the desire to have more, to assert oneself, to feel proud of one's accomplishments, to trust one's own judgment, to experience pleasure without immediately cataloging its spiritual dangers. All of these become not simply behaviors to be moderated, but evidence of an inner corruption that requires constant management. The suppression of desire that Christian moral formation often produced has its own particular psychological signature. Desires that cannot be acknowledged, examined, and addressed through honest self-reflection do not disappear. They go underground. They emerge in distorted forms, in compulsive behaviors, in harsh judgment of others who display the desires one cannot permit oneself in projection, in the peculiar intensity with which some deeply morally formed people pursue the punishment of precisely those sins they are most severely tempted by. The history of religious sexual scandal is not simply a history of individual hypocrisy. It is partly a predictable consequence of a moral system that does not allow the integration of desire but demands its suppression, and that creates, under conditions of sufficient pressure, the conditions for explosion. The fear of pride produces its own specific wound. A person who has been raised with the genuine, deep, emotionally reinforced conviction that the gravest spiritual danger they face is the danger of thinking too well of themselves has been trained to experience confidence, self-assertion, and self-trust as early warning signs of spiritual crisis. This can produce an adult who is psychologically incapable of standing fully behind their own judgment, who reflexively defers to authority not out of intellectual humility, but out of a moral formation that has made self-trust feel dangerous. It can produce someone who apologizes compulsively, who cannot receive praise without immediately deflecting it, who experiences competence and success as occasions for anxiety rather than satisfaction. These are not abstract philosophical concerns. They are patterns that appear with striking regularity in the clinical and spiritual literature produced by people who were raised inside intense Christian moral formation. The emotional burden of moral perfection deserves its own careful attention. The standard that Christian morality sets is not simply high. It is, in its most serious formulations, literally infinite, because the standard is the character of God. The believer is called to love their enemies, to be perfect as their heavenly Father is perfect, to maintain not just behavioral conformity, but interior purity, to be free of envy, lust, pride, anger, and the 1,000 other movements of the inner life that the tradition classified as sinful. The gap between that standard and any actual human life is not small. It is permanent and unbridgeable by definition. A person who has internalized that standard as genuinely obligatory has been given a task they cannot complete, and a moral vocabulary in which the inability to complete it is itself further evidence of their need for grace, further confirmation of their inadequacy, and further reason to remain attached to the institution that manages the gap between what they should be and what they actually are. We have now traced the entire arc of the beautiful trap. It began in the ancient world, inside the suffering of people who had been made small by forces they could not control. It offered them a reversal. It told them that their weakness was holiness, that their suffering was meaningful, that their submission was virtue, and that the strength of those who oppressed them was moral corruption. It gave them identity, dignity, and a framework of meaning in which the humiliated were secretly the elect. That was genuinely powerful. That was genuinely beautiful. Nietzsche did not deny it. What he refused to let rest was the question of what happened next, when that morality of the oppressed became the morality of an empire, and eventually the morality of a civilization, and eventually the inner architecture of the conscience of people who were no longer oppressed by anything except the moral system itself. The machinery we have examined across this investigation is not simple. It is not the machinery of cynics who designed a trap from the outside and placed it in front of the unsuspecting. It is the machinery of sincere people, deeply sincere people, who transmitted to the next generation the inner life they themselves had been given, complete with its structures of guilt, shame, suspicion of desire, fear of pride, and the training to experience submission as virtue. The sincerity of the transmission is not in question. The question is what the machinery produces, what kind of inner life it consistently creates, and whether that inner life is genuinely free or whether it is the most intimate possible form of captivity. a captivity that feels like conscience, that feels like righteousness, that feels, from the inside, exactly like goodness. The trap is beautiful because it offers real things. It offers belonging to the person who was isolated. It offers meaning to the person who was suffering. It offers a framework of justice to the person who had been crushed by the injustice of the world. It offers a community to the person who was alone. Those are not illusions. But the same system that offers those real things also teaches you to experience your own strength as danger, your own desire as corruption, your own questioning as pride, and your own liberation as a spiritual risk. And when a system has taught you all of that, it no longer needs a lock, because by the time you have fully absorbed its moral vocabulary, the door opens inward, and you have learned to call the inside of the room your home. The investigation does not end with despair. It ends with vision, the possibility of examining what you inherited clearly enough to decide what is actually yours, what serves your genuine flourishing, and what was placed inside you in service of something other than your freedom. If that possibility interests you, the rest of this archive is worth exploring carefully. The heretic lens exists for exactly this investigation, the examination of sacred authority, not to destroy what is meaningful, but to free what is meaningful from what was only ever fear wearing the face of virtue. If you have not yet subscribed, this is the moment. What follows may be the most important part of what we are about to examine together. The strongest evidence for Nietzsche's critique of Christian morality as a mechanism of psychological control is not located in a single text or a single historical event. It is located in a convergence of patterns across historical documents, across the development of Christian institutional practice, across the observable psychology of people formed by that practice, and across the internal logic of the moral system itself. When multiple lines of evidence point in the same direction, the convergence becomes difficult to dismiss as coincidence or selective reading. The first line of evidence comes from the internal documents of the ascetic tradition itself. The writings of the Desert Fathers, the Rule of Saint Benedict, the spiritual exercises of Ignatius of Loyola, and the vast literature of Christian spiritual direction across the centuries are remarkably consistent in their treatment of the inner life. They treat desire as the primary location of spiritual danger. They treat the will, especially the will that resists spiritual authority, as the primary instrument of sin. They develop elaborate methods for identifying, monitoring, confessing, and suppressing the movements of the inner life that deviate from the authorized standard. Reading these documents through Nietzsche's lens does not require distorting them. They describe, in their own language and with their own spiritual sincerity, exactly the psychological regime that Nietzsche was analyzing. The second line of evidence comes from the history of Christian discipline and punishment of theological deviance. The mechanisms developed by the institutional church for managing those who questioned its teachings, whether through informal social pressure, formal exclusion, or in the most extreme historical cases, through the apparatus of inquisition and physical punishment, reveal something important about the relationship between moral authority and the suppression of intellectual independence. A moral system that defines questioning its own premises as a form of pride, and that has institutional mechanisms for managing those who exhibit this pride, has moved beyond mere intellectual disagreement. It has made intellectual independence itself a moral category and a negative one. The third line of evidence comes from the psychological patterns observed in populations that have been intensively formed by Christian moral teaching. The clinical and pastoral literature of the 20th and 21st centuries, written in many cases by practicing Christians who were also trained psychologists, contains extensive documentation of what has sometimes been called religious wounding or religious trauma. This literature describes patterns of chronic guilt that persist long after any specific transgression has been addressed, shame about the body and its desires that interferes with healthy, intimate relationships, difficulty with self-trust and self-advocacy, compulsive apologizing, and an internal critical voice so well-developed and so relentless that it functions as a form of psychological self-persecution. These are not the observations of atheist polemicists. They are the observations of Christian therapists and pastoral counselors trying to help people who were formed by the same tradition they themselves inhabit. The fourth line of evidence is the pattern that Nietzsche himself identified in the genealogy of specific moral terms. When he traced the history of words like good and evil across Greek, Latin, and Germanic linguistic traditions, he found that the content of those terms had undergone a systematic inversion. What had been called good in aristocratic ancient contexts, nobility, strength, self-assertion, excellence, became, under Christian influence, morally suspect or actively condemned. What had been called base or low, weakness, suffering, submission, the condition of the enslaved, became the location of the highest spiritual virtue. Whether one accepts the full weight of Nietzsche's genealogical argument, the basic historical observation is not disputable. Christian morality did represent a significant restructuring of the moral vocabulary of the ancient world, and that restructuring consistently elevated the qualities of the powerless and condemned the qualities of the powerful. The fifth piece of evidence is the most intimate and perhaps the most difficult to evaluate: the internal testimony of people who grew up inside intensive Christian moral formation and who, upon leaving that formation, discovered that the guilt, the shame, the self-suspicion, and the chronic sense of unworthiness did not leave with the theology. The psychological structures that the moral system built remain active even after the doctrinal premises that justified them have been abandoned. This persistence is evidence that what was built was not merely a set of beliefs that can be updated when new information arrives. What was built was a structure of the inner life, a pattern of self-relation that was embedded at a level deeper than conscious theological commitment. The fact that the structure outlasts the belief is one of the most precise pieces of evidence available for Nietzsche's claim that what Christian morality produced, more than any specific doctrine, was a particular kind of self. The strongest defense of Christian morality is not the one that simply denies Nietzsche's analysis. The strongest defense is the one that points to what Christian morality actually accomplished in the world, and what the world looked like before and after its influence became widespread. And that defense is serious. It is intellectually honest, and it cannot be dismissed without intellectual dishonesty of our own. The ancient world that preceded the spread of Christian moral teaching was not a paradise of noble vitality. It was a world in which the strong imposed their will on the weak as a matter of course, as an expression of what was understood to be the natural and proper order of things. It was a world in which the exposure of unwanted infants was a normal domestic practice. It was a world in which enslaved human beings were not merely an economic class, but a legally defined category of non-persons who could be killed by their owners without legal consequence. It was a world in which the suffering of those at the bottom of the social hierarchy was not simply unfortunate, but philosophically rationalized as the natural expression of their inferior nature. The Stoic and Aristotelian traditions contained sophisticated moral thinking, but they did not produce widespread cultural pressure toward the relief of suffering across social lines. Christian moral teaching, whatever its complications, did produce that pressure, and its effects were historically real. The Christian moral insistence on the dignity of every human being, grounded in the theological claim that every person is made in the image of God and redeemed by the same sacrificial act, introduced into Western moral culture a principle of universal human worth that had no clear precedent in the dominant philosophical traditions of the ancient world. That principle was the historical root of arguments for the abolition of slavery, for the dignity of the poor, for the legal protection of children, for the treatment of the mentally ill as human beings rather than as burdens to be managed or discarded. The people who made those arguments drew on Christian moral vocabulary to make them. To dismiss Christian morality as simply a mechanism of social control is to dismiss the intellectual and moral resources that drove some of the most significant expansions of human dignity in recorded history. The Christian ideal of forgiveness, whatever its complications under Nietzsche's analysis, has also proven to be a culturally generative resource in contexts of extreme social conflict. The movement led by Martin Luther King Jr. in the American civil rights struggle drew explicitly and consciously on Christian moral vocabulary, on the ideals of nonviolent suffering, forgiveness toward enemies, and the dignity of the oppressed, to challenge precisely the kind of social hierarchy that Nietzsche's analysis might have predicted it would reinforce. The tradition contains resources that are not reducible to the function of stabilizing hierarchy. Those resources have sometimes been used, with genuine courage and genuine effectiveness, to challenge the hierarchies that other parts of the same tradition had normalized. And on the question of guilt itself, the defense of Christian morality would argue that the capacity to feel genuine moral guilt, to recognize one's own failures and take responsibility for them, is not a psychological wound. It is one of the essential capacities of a moral agent, a person who feels no guilt about harm they have caused, who has no inner mechanism for recognizing the gap between their actual behavior and the standards they claim to hold, is not liberated. They are dangerous. The Christian cultivation of the conscience, whatever its excesses, produced generations of people who took seriously their obligations to others, who recognized their capacity for harm, and who felt the weight of their moral failures in ways that motivated amendment. A critique of conscience must be careful not to become an argument for the abolition of moral self-reflection. The objection is serious, and it has been taken seriously throughout this investigation. But the problem that Nietzsche identified does not dissolve in the face of those real historical accomplishments. The reason is that the objection and the critique are addressing different levels of the same phenomenon. The objection is pointing to the social and cultural fruits of Christian moral teaching across history. Nietzsche's critique is pointing to the psychological structure the teaching builds inside the individual. Both observations can be simultaneously true. A moral system can produce real cultural goods, the expansion of legal protections for vulnerable people, the development of hospitals and charitable institutions, the moral vocabulary that enabled civil rights movements, and still produce in its most thoroughly formed individual adherents a psychological architecture of chronic unworthiness, shame about the body, and a trained incapacity for self-trust. The social goods and the psychological costs do not cancel each other out. They coexist, and the coexistence is precisely what makes the evaluation so difficult and so important to do carefully. The argument that Christian morality protected the weak from the cruelty of the strong is historically significant, but it does not address Nietzsche's core psychological claim, which is that the same moral vocabulary used to protect the weak also trained the weak to remain weak by treating self-assertion, ambition, pride, and the desire for more than their assigned portion as spiritually dangerous. protecting someone from external oppression while training them to oppress themselves from the inside is not a simple liberation. It is the replacement of one form of captivity with another, more intimate one. The Martin Luther King objection, the point that Christian moral vocabulary has been used by the oppressed to challenge oppression, is perhaps the most powerful variant of the defense. And Nietzsche's framework has a response that is worth considering carefully. It is possible that the tradition contains resources that point beyond its own most psychologically constraining elements. It is possible that the genuine moral core of the tradition, the affirmation of universal human dignity, the obligation to the suffering neighbor, the critique of unjust power, can be separated from the psychological apparatus of guilt, shame, and self-suspicion, and used in service of something more genuinely liberating. If so, the question becomes not whether to reject the tradition entirely, but whether to be honest about which parts of it serve human flourishing and which parts of it serve something else. The problem remains, finally, because the psychological patterns that Nietzsche described are empirically observable and well documented. They do not disappear because the tradition also contains a history of genuine moral courage. Both histories are real. Both need to be held. And the holding of both, without collapsing either into the other, is precisely the kind of mature, honest examination that this investigation has been moving toward from the beginning. When you look at Christian morality through the lens this investigation has opened, it does not suddenly become simple. It becomes more complex, and that complexity is not a failure of the examination. It is the result of seeing something more fully than the inherited framework invited you to see it. Christian morality, examined through the historical and philosophical lens we have used, appears as a multi-layered phenomenon that simultaneously contains genuine moral insights and a psychological architecture that can produce significant human suffering. It is not simply good. It is not simply bad. It is something more historically dense and more humanly complicated than either of those simple judgments allows. What becomes visible is the distinction between the tradition's most genuinely liberating moral impulses and the institutional, psychological, and social machinery through which those impulses were transmitted. The impulse to recognize the dignity of every human being regardless of social position, the insistence that the suffering of the powerless matters morally, the teaching that love and compassion should govern our treatment of other people, these are not automatically invalidated by Nietzsche's analysis. They are moral insights that have proven generative across many different contexts and many different kinds of human community. The question is whether it is possible to hold those insights without also holding the chronic guilt, the shame about the body, the fear of pride, and the suspicion of self-affirmation that the tradition's moral formation has so often bundled with them. What also becomes visible is the degree to which the moral framework was historically contingent, shaped by specific social and political circumstances, by the particular suffering of particular populations, and by the institutional interests of particular organizations at particular moments in time. This does not automatically make the values false. Historical contingency does not equal falsity, but it does mean that the values cannot be treated as if they arrived from outside history and outside human interest. They were made by human beings, under human conditions, in response to human pressures. That is precisely what makes them available for examination, because things that were made can be examined, revised, questioned, and if necessary, changed. The moral psychology that Christian teaching produced, the well-formed conscience with its capacity for genuine moral reflection and its tendency toward chronic self-punishment appears as something that requires careful evaluation rather than wholesale acceptance or wholesale rejection. The capacity for moral self-reflection is genuinely valuable. The chronic guilt that outlives any specific moral failure, the shame that attaches to the body and its desires as a permanent condition, the fear of self-trust that the tradition too often installed alongside its genuine moral teachings, these are costs that deserve to be acknowledged clearly, not explained away by pointing to the tradition's historical accomplishments. Perhaps most importantly, the examination reveals that the moral vocabulary you may have inherited is not the only moral vocabulary available to you. The Christian tradition does not exhaust the resources of human moral thinking. Other traditions, philosophical, spiritual, and cultural, have approached questions of how to treat other people, how to relate to suffering, how to balance self-care and care for others, how to live with integrity without installing the same psychological apparatus of guilt, shame, and self-suspicion. That does not mean those traditions have no problems of their own. It means that the inherited framework is one option among others, not the final and unchallengeable word on what goodness requires of a human being. The examined version of Christian morality, the version you can see after following this investigation to its conclusion, is a morally complex historical tradition that contains genuine insights, genuine wisdom, and genuine examples of moral courage alongside a psychological machinery that has produced, in many of its most thoroughly formed adherents, a relationship with themselves that does not look like freedom. Holding both of those truths without collapsing either is not comfortable, but it is honest. And after everything we have examined, honesty is the only foundation worth building on. The investigation you have just followed does not mean that compassion is a mistake. It does not mean that kindness is a form of weakness. It does not mean that forgiveness is always a trap, or that every impulse toward self-restraint is evidence of internalized oppression. The critique of a moral system's psychological machinery is not the same as the rejection of everything that system touched. Nietzsche himself, whatever his reputation suggests, was not calling for a world of cruelty and domination. He was calling for honesty about where values come from and what they actually produce in human life. The critique of guilt does not mean that accountability is unnecessary. The argument that Christian moral formation has produced chronic shame and self-punishment in many of its adherents is not an argument that people should feel nothing about the harm they cause. Genuine moral guilt, the kind that recognizes a specific wrong, motivates repair, and then releases the person to move forward, is a genuinely functional moral emotion. What Nietzsche was pointing at is not that capacity, but its pathological extension, the guilt that never resolves, the shame that attaches to one's very existence, the conscience that has been trained to function as a permanent indictment rather than as a specific and remedial signal. The critique of humility does not mean that arrogance is a virtue. There is a significant difference between the kind of humility that accurately recognizes one's limitations while still affirming one's genuine worth, and the kind of humility that has been trained to treat self-affirmation itself as a moral danger. The first kind is psychologically healthy and socially beneficial. The second kind is what Nietzsche was interrogating. To examine the second kind critically is not to endorse the first kind's opposite. It is to call for a more honest self-relation, one that can hold both genuine limitation and genuine worth without collapsing into either arrogant grandiosity or self-denying shame. And finally, the investigation does not call for contempt toward people who live inside the framework that has been examined. The point has been made several times in this archive, and it bears repeating in the clearest possible terms. the ordinary believer who found genuine comfort, genuine community, genuine moral structure, and genuine meaning inside Christian teaching, is not the target of this examination. The examination is directed at the machinery behind the meaning, at the question of what psychological structures the moral system installs, in addition to the meaning it provides. A person can be genuinely helped by something that also genuinely constrains them. Both experiences can be real. Both deserve respect. What becomes possible after this examination is not the freedom of having no values. That is not freedom. That is simply disorientation without a compass. What becomes possible is a different relationship with your moral life, one that is chosen rather than simply inherited, one that is honest about its own origins rather than defended against examination, one that serves your genuine flourishing rather than the institutional or psychological needs of a system that has long since left the specific historical circumstances that produced it. Nietzsche's affirmative vision, the part of his work that gets far less attention than his critiques, pointed toward the possibility of what he called the revaluation of values from a position of strength rather than resentment. He was pointing toward a moral life that begins with a yes, a genuine affirmation of one's own vitality, one's own capacities, one's own existence, rather than a moral life that begins with the premise of one's own inadequacy and works upward from there through confession, penance, and the management of guilt. That affirmative beginning does not exclude compassion, does not exclude care for others, does not exclude the recognition of one's genuine limitations. It simply refuses to begin from the premise that one's basic existence is already a problem requiring resolution. Compassion that does not require self-hatred is possible. There is a form of genuine care for others that does not demand the suppression of one's own needs, the denial of one's own worth, or the framing of one's own desires as spiritually dangerous. It is the compassion of someone who respects themselves enough to genuinely respect others, not the self-denying service of someone who has been taught that their own needs and desires are suspect, and that only in service to others can they justify their existence. The difference between these two forms of care is not theoretical. It is lived. And the person who has crossed from the second form to the first knows immediately and precisely that something has changed, that the care they now offer is more freely given and more genuinely received. Honesty, as a moral value, does not require the authority of a religious institution to ground it. The commitment to seeing clearly, to speaking accurately, to not deceiving oneself or others for the sake of comfort or social acceptability, is a moral commitment that stands on its own foundations. It does not need the threat of divine punishment to make it binding. It needs only the recognition that a life built on self-deception is not actually a life being fully lived. Nietzsche called this intellectual conscience, the standard of honesty applied not just to external statements, but to the commitments one makes about the deepest questions of existence, including the commitment to examine the moral framework one inherited without flinching from what the examination reveals. Strength, as Nietzsche used the term, has nothing to do with the domination of others. It refers to the capacity to affirm one's own existence, to trust one's own perception, to stand behind one's own judgment, and to engage with the world from a place of genuine vitality rather than chronic inadequacy. A person who has moved through the examination this archive has offered and arrived on the other side with their own moral voice intact, a voice that is genuinely theirs rather than simply the echo of an inherited system, is someone who is exercising exactly the kind of strength that Nietzsche considered the foundation of a morality worth choosing. Freedom beyond dogma is not freedom from all belief. It is freedom from belief held through fear. It is the difference between a faith chosen in full awareness of its history and complications, embraced because it genuinely serves your flourishing and your honest engagement with the world, and a faith maintained by the terror of what might happen if you allowed yourself to examine it. Whatever you choose to believe after this examination, choose it with your eyes open. Choose it having seen the machinery behind it. Choose it having asked who made these values, under what conditions, in service of what needs. And if, after that examination, you still find genuine worth in what you find, then the worth you find is genuinely yours. That is not heresy. That is the deepest form of intellectual and spiritual integrity. A trap is most powerful when it does not look like a trap. It looks like virtue, humility, obedience, purity, sacrifice, and the promise that suffering itself can make you holy. The beauty was not decoration. The beauty was the mechanism. Because a trap that looked like a trap would be stepped around, but a trap that looked like goodness, that felt like grace, that sounded like the voice of conscience speaking from the most intimate center of the self, that trap did not need a lock. By the time the believer had absorbed its moral language deeply enough to think in its categories, to feel guilt in its rhythms, to experience self-affirmation as the beginning of sin, the door was not locked from the outside. It was held shut from the inside, and the hand holding it believed, with perfect sincerity, that it was holding something sacred. That is the question this archive leaves with you, and it is a question worth sitting with before you answer it. When you look at the moral framework you inherited, whether you still inhabit it, whether you have left it, or whether you are standing at its threshold trying to decide, does Christian morality liberate the soul by giving it a structure of genuine meaning? Does it discipline the weak by training them to remain so? Or does it do both of those things at once, in the same breath, with the same beautiful and complicated voice? Leave your answer in the comments. The conversation that follows may be the most important part of the archive.